Isaiah 53 is one of the most significant and discussed chapters in the book of Isaiah, often referred to as the fourth servant song. This chapter is famous for its portrayal of the suffering servant, a figure who suffers and dies for the sins of others. Many Christian theologians see this chapter as prophetic of Jesus Christ, while Jewish interpretations generally understand it in the context of the nation of Israel, or a righteous individual suffering on behalf of the people. Below, I'll provide an overview and explanation of each verse in Isaiah 53, reflecting a general perspective that incorporates insights from both Christian and Jewish traditions. Verse 1, who has believed our message and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? This verse opens with a rhetorical question about belief in the report of the suffering servant and the revelation of the Lord's power. It suggests a message that has been largely disregarded or not understood by the masses. Verse 2, he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. The servant is described as coming from humble beginnings and lacking any physical attractiveness or majesty that would draw people to him. Verse 3, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. This verse highlights the servant's suffering, rejection, and isolation from society, emphasizing his familiarity with pain and sorrow. Verse 4, surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. It suggests that the servant's sufferings were for the sake of others' transgressions, yet people mistakenly believed he was being punished by God for his own sins. Verse 5, but he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. This central verse clearly states that the servant's suffering was vicarious, bearing the punishment for others' sins, which brings healing and peace to them. Verse 6, we all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It emphasizes human waywardness and sinfulness, and declares that the Lord has placed the collective sin of humanity upon the servant. Verse 7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This verse portrays the servant's submission and silence in the face of oppression and affliction, drawing a parallel with a lamb being led to slaughter. Verse 8, by oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living, for the transgression of my people he was punished. This speaks to the unjust treatment and the consequence of his suffering, indicating that his life was cut short as a result of bearing the punishment for others. Verse 9, he was assigned a grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Despite his innocence, the servant is treated as a criminal in death, yet there's a note of nobility or honor in his burial. Verse 10, yet it was the Lord's will to crush him, and cause him to suffer, and though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. This verse introduces the idea that the servant's suffering was according to divine will, with a purpose of making his life an offering for sin, leading to a positive outcome that includes seeing his offspring and the prospering of God's will. Verse 11, after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. This verse promises vindication for the servant after his suffering, suggesting that his sacrifice will justify many by bearing their sins. Verse 12, therefore I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death, and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many, and made intercession. for the transgressors. The final verse concludes the prophecy with a promise of honor and reward for the servant's self-sacrifice. It emphasizes that the servant willingly faced death and was associated with sinners, yet his actions were redemptive, bearing the sins of many and interceding on behalf of transgressors. This act of self-giving is recognized and rewarded by God, with the servant being exalted and sharing in victory. The chapter as a whole portrays a figure whose suffering, rejection, and eventual vindication are depicted in vivid and emotive language. This suffering servant's experiences and the purpose behind them, bearing the sins of others and interceding for transgressors, are central themes that have been interpreted in various ways throughout history. In Christian theology, this chapter is often seen as a clear prophecy of Jesus Christ's crucifixion, death, and resurrection, highlighting his role as a redeemer. In Jewish interpretations, the figure is sometimes understood as symbolic of Israel's suffering for the sake of the world, or as representing a righteous individual whose suffering served to atone for others.